A reading from 1 Kings. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way."
Well, let me start out here today with the word that gets our hearts racing and our palms sweating. Are you ready? Trouble. We all know about it. The fact that we're alive means that we've had to face trouble from time to time, some of us continually. So let me ask a question in light of this. How do you face trouble? How do you face it? Courageously, fearfully, trustingly, hopefully, anxiously, or some combination of all those? How do you face trouble? Well, our scripture text for this morning gives us the portrait of the prophet Elijah, who we see is in real trouble. And it shows us how he's helped to face it. So here's the background of his story. Elijah was a prophet who zealously guarded the exclusive worship of Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. So he was alarmed to see that the Israelites had begun worshiping other gods of the region, especially the fertility god Baal. Therefore, Elijah devised a clever way to put an end to the lure of Baal worship among the Israelites once and for all. He decided to challenge those prophets of Baal to a little competition. And he invited all the Israelites to come on out and watch the spectacle. So then Elijah directed the prophets of Baal to prepare a sacrifice as an offering, but not to burn the offering themselves. Rather, they were to call upon their god, Baal, to rain down fire and burn up the offering. Well, the story tells us that they danced and whooped and shouted all around the altar for half a day, with Elijah taunting them with sarcastic comments, and all without result. No fire. So, now it was Elijah's turn. He too prepared an offering to be burned. And then, apparently for dramatic effect, he had jars full of water poured all over the offering once, twice, and then a third time, just to make sure everyone knew everything was good and wet. And then finally, he called upon Yahweh, the God of Israel, and fire fell and consumed the offering and licked up all the water. So far, so good. Now, up to this point, that's a great bedtime story. But hang on, because here comes the grisly part. Taking his success As an obvious sign of God's exclusive favor for him, Elijah then ordered all the frenzied Israelites who were standing and watching to seize the 850 prophets of Baal and kill them all, which he did. And now we see why the story tells us that Queen Jezebel was angry with Elijah, who had killed all her prophets and advisors. So she's now out to kill him. So, one might say that Elijah has a problem here. He may be our hero, but he's gotten himself into some real trouble. And how did it happen? Well, doesn't it seem that his perfect certainty has led him to behave in a way that's alienated him from just about everybody, and especially now the queen? And I wonder, in this jam, do you think any doubt surfaced for Elijah? Trouble can bring you to that point, can't it? Trouble can bring you to the point of self-doubt, but that's not always bad. Did you know that the Talmud, that all-important Hebrew book of scriptural and faith commentary, says that there are 3 particularly sacred words? The 3 words are, I don't know. I love that. I don't know. Now, I'm thinking those words are sacred because a little doubt once in a while, a little doubt and a little uncertainty breeds in us a little humility, which can actually bring us closer to God. After all, if we're less sure of ourselves, less wrapped up in our own certainty about everything, we could have just a little more room to be more open to God, a little sure of God. So is I don't know part of your vocabulary? Well, Elijah's initial doubt and unknowing rapidly collapses into despair, and he flees to a cave in the desert. And there in the desert, his despair of not knowing, we're told, leads him to just want to die. Ever been that desperate in times of trouble? Frederick Buechner, in commentary about such times, says something I think we need to think about. He says this: the deepest despair God reserves for the saints, because maybe only the saints can withstand such doubt as that. Now that's an interesting linkage, don't you think? Doubt, despair, and sainthood. Notice now, Buechner doesn't link sainthood with certainty. Certainty, as we've seen in Elijah's story, can lead to problems. No, Buechner links sainthood with not knowing. He links sainthood to doubt. Well, Elijah may deserve sainthood for the depth of his doubts here, because through the doubt and despair, a little opening comes for him. So he re-encounters the sacred. He rediscovers God finally in this time. So how does it happen? Well, we are told in his doubt-filled moments that Elijah does hear God's voice asking him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, you could take that question at face value and suppose that it meant, "How come you're hidden in the cave?" or "Why did you come to the desert today?" But surely the significance of that question ran deeper. What are you doing here, Elijah? It's more like, take stock of yourself, your life. What brought you to this point? Now, I think this is an accounting before God of the most serious proportions. And the prospect of answering such a question is sobering, isn't it? How could any of us respond to it? Looking back now, over all the important moments in your life, weddings, births, job changes, moves, health challenges, if you were asked, "What are you doing here?" at that point, how would you have responded? Well, let's note Elijah's response. There in the hiding place, he doesn't answer that penetrating question from God directly. Instead, he shouts out in all his despair, "I alone am left. I am alone." In fact, I wonder if that wasn't the very essence of his despair, or maybe even ours in times of trouble, the sense of feeling utterly alone in it. One of my sons in years past was subject to night terrors. Anybody have experience with these? It's an odd experience of wakeful sleeping or sleeping wakefulness where people can dream horribly frightening episodes and yet not be reachable, not be wakeable from the terror. And I distinctly remember an occasion when he shouted in panic in the middle of the night, and I woke up with my heart pounding and ran to find him sitting bolt upright in bed with his eyes wide open, but in the fearsome grip of one of these night terrors. And I couldn't break through to him. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't connect. I could see this anguish on his face and all the fear, but I could do nothing. And even though he was calling for me, and I was there to answer the call, he was unaware of it. I tried everything I could think of to wake him up, but he simply didn't perceive my presence there, and he just felt totally alone. And I'll never forget his fright. Well, when God asked Elijah, "What are you doing here?" and he receives the despairing lament in reply, "I am alone," the story says that God put on just a remarkable display for Elijah. Strong winds split rocks, an earthquake rumbles, a fire rages by. And I think God was trying to wake Elijah up out of his own kind of night terror, a terror of aloneness. But Elijah won't even peek out of the cave. He's not wakeable. Finally, though, the world falls utterly silent, and Elijah ventures out of the cave, and now God asks him a second time, "What are you doing here?" Now, maybe Elijah's first answer wasn't to God's liking. Maybe God asks a second time, hoping that after all the natural displays, that Elijah's going to come up with a different answer. But Elijah is nothing if not consistent here, and he says in the same despairing way again, "I am alone." Now, maybe a question of such significance as "What are you doing here?" bears repeating in a life, including our lives from time to time. Maybe reconsideration of that could prompt a change of purpose for us or jar us awake to new perspectives, new realities around us that we've been a little blind to. What are you doing here, in this time, in this place, with your life? God might be asking us to consider that, to move us from aloneness or despair or doubt to new purpose and new hope. I read an interesting linguistic study of the word hope recently. In Hebrew, the word for hope is tikva, and within the word tikva is a second Hebrew word, the word meaning line. So the word line is framed by a few extra letters on each end to form the longer Hebrew word hope. And then the author of this word study posed a question for the readers. What kind of connection in meaning do you suppose there might be between these two words that determined the word hope should grow up out of the word line? Now, I found that an interesting thought. How are lines and hope connected? Could it be that hope is in fact a kind of a line, a link? If we are in trouble or in despair, maybe we can search out lines of connection to draw us out of the trouble. Lines of connection could be our best source of hope in troubled times. Well, asking Elijah the second time what he was doing in the cave and receiving for a second time the answer, "I am alone," God stops asking. Instead now, God gives Elijah a new commission. He says, "Go, return on your way." God might have said, "Come on, Elijah, come out of the cave, come out of isolation, come out and get involved in the world where there's more trouble to face, yes, uncertainty, sure, but there's hope too, comprised of all the messy, blessed lines of human connectedness. Go and draw on those." Now, just for a moment here today, can you stop and consider all the lines of connectedness in your life? What are your connections? Do they support you? Do they offer you hope and sustain you? I think we're meant to find those connections, whether they're connections drawn on family or friends or here at church or elsewhere. And most importantly, our faith can be a connecting line of hope to God. And I think this story today about Elijah wants us to see that God is ready to support us in ways we don't fully appreciate, at times when we're in trouble, at times when we feel most alone, and even when we're asleep, so to speak, to that support from God and just plain unaware of it. Still, God is trying to reach us. Perhaps Elijah's most serious error was in not recognizing that even though he was in deep trouble, even though he had no visible supporters left, even though he kept telling himself, I am alone, in fact, he was not. And of course, neither are we. As I've mentioned, I worked in chaplaincy for some time, and among my most poignant encounters over the years were those on a Huntington's disease unit. Huntington's disease is an inherited degenerative brain disease, and the disease slowly isolates its sufferers by loss of speech and inability to control movements. One of my patients from that unit was Mary. Mary had been an extremely active woman before the disease really took hold, and everything about engaging the world was a great joy to her. People were a joy to Mary, to be shared and savored to the fullest. But her disease was robbing her of her most important connections to others. It was slowly but surely isolating her. When I first met Mary, she was able to converse with me pretty well, but as the disease progressed, we had to resort to a sort of trial and error kind of communication. She tried to talk, and I made the errors in trying to decipher what the meaning of the sounds she was making might be. I knew that Mary loved the 23rd Psalm, preferably in the King James translation, so we'd recite it together as best we could. But as her speech worsened, she gave up being able to recite it whole, and instead she saved her energy for the best parts of the psalm. So she'd shout them out with gusto when we got there in our recitation. So Mary's version of the psalm, condensed to its critical component features, was shepherd, green pastures, still waters, no evil, with me, anoint, cup, mercy, forever. And then as the months passed and the disease progressed, Mary shortened the psalm further, and it was simply shepherd, with me, mercy, forever. And that version was particularly pleasing to Mary. It lasted for several months. But I distinctly remember coming in one morning to find that Mary had experienced a major life change, awakening, you might say. She had nearly died in a choking episode, and in that time she saw Jesus. Now, explain it as you will, it was utterly convincing to Mary, and now the future held no fear for her at all. We talked about this experience and its significance for her for a long time. Talking anything through with Mary took a long time now. And finally, we ended by praying together her favorite, the 23rd Psalm. But this was the wonderful thing. She had the whole psalm condensed now into just 2 words. When I reached them in the psalm, she smiled and she whispered them. And the words were just, with me. Now, I've thought about that so many times. And you know, if the Talmud claims that I don't know our sacred words, then I want to submit to you that with me are sacred words too, because they proclaim to us one thing we surely do know, that God is with me and you is indisputable. With me is the core of what we know about God's presence in the world. And if we stop to consider, isn't so much of what we assert as Christians about the incarnation, Jesus Christ born among us, this very same precious and comforting insight that God finds perfectly astounding ways to be with us. We enjoy his presence every time we share the meal set for us at this communion table. God thinks of countless ways to reach us. Always has, always will. We are not alone. That's the basis of Christian faith and our most thorough and effective source of comfort in times of trouble. When we feel most isolated, that's our connecting line within a whole framework of sacred and unquenchable hope. So, my friends, no matter where you are in life or what trouble you face, may you always know God is with you. Amen.